Good day, everyone, and welcome to Jake and Michael's Knowledge Series. Today, we're going to be looking at the business analysis core concepts, the fundamentals, the things that make up business analysis. We're going to consider the BACCM, the core concept model. We're going to consider key terms that you should know or familiarize yourself with as a business analyst. We're going to cover requirement classification schema, the definitions of stakeholders, who they are, and the requirement analysis or requirements and design. So let's get right into it. Now, the business analysis core concept model is a conceptual framework for business analysts, right? Is the foundation of business analysis. It's the lens through which every business analyst should see their work. It encompasses what business analysis is and what it means to the people who perform business analysis tasks. And it applies across perspectives, industries, methodologies. It's composed of 6 terms, irrespective of the methodology at the level in the industry or the level in the organization. Business analysis core concept models will work for you. There are 6 terms that make up the business analysis core concept model. They are interrelated and they have a common meaning to all business analysts around the world. It helps us to be able to have a common terminology for discussing business analysis activities. And each 6 terms is considered to be fundamentally part of the BACCMs, meaning it's a core concept. We use them, the BACCMs, to describe the profession and the domain of business analysis, to communicate about business analysis using a common terminology to evaluate the relationship of these key concepts one to another in business analysis, to perform better analysis by holistically evaluating the relationship between one concept and another amongst the 6 concepts, and to be able to evaluate the impact of these concepts and relationships at any point in the work effort, so that we can both establish the foundation for the work and chart a course forward. Now, the BACCMs, like we said, are 6 concepts: change, need, solution, stakeholder, value, and context. And you find these terms, right, being applied in the definition of business analysis. You should remember the definition of business analysis. Business analysis is the practice of enabling change in an enterprise by defining the needs and recommending solutions that provide value to stakeholders. And the only specific word in the BACCMs that was not used directly in the definition is context. However, it's a very important thing in business analysis. Now, let's look at the definitions of the core concepts. We have change. Change is the act of transformation in response to a need. We have need, where a need is a problem or opportunity to be addressed. We have solution, which is a specific way of satisfying one or more needs, right? So let's take this over again so that it can be more descriptive. Where change is the act of transforming transforming in response to a need. Every time an organization goes through a problem, it needs to solve it. And every time an organization sees an opportunity that would help it grow, it needs to capitalize on it. So what a change does is that it provides a medium for us to be able to carry out this transformation in response to a need, which might be a problem, right, or an opportunity. So assume that there is an emerging market. There's an emerging market type that a business has not capitalized on, and it needs to design product for that new market. That's a transformation with response to a need. A need in this case is an opportunity. Right? Now, a need can be a problem, on the other hand, or an opportunity to be addressed. It is addressed through a change. Now, a very good example of a need is that let's assume our industry has gone digitalized and we still use analog solution, very similar to what was a problem in the banking industry in Nigeria for quite at a point in time. A need could be that our product is, the product is becoming obsolete. Competitors are releasing new fantastic products that our markets love. and there's a likelihood that they're going to teach us for the competitor. That's a need, and we need to address this using the project. The solution is a specific way of satisfying one or more needs in a context, right? So we could have a couple of ways we can be able to provision or to be able to deal with the problem or the opportunity. These options that we have for satisfying the need, so we'll call a solution. The stakeholder, people who have a relationship with the change, the need, or the solution. So a stakeholder will be affected, impacted, or involved in the change, right? Defining the need, the recommending or using the solution. That's a stakeholder, right? So in the examples we gave, the people who will produce the solution, the people who will provide information on the need and its details, they are all stakeholders. Now, value is the worth or the importance or the usefulness of something to a solution, to a stakeholder within a context. So a solution is supposed to provide some form of value. Documents that are used, the inputs, the outputs, the business analysis plan, uh, and organizational assets are supposed to come together to be able to provide value to stakeholders. So yes, the goal of business analysis is to a very large extent to ensure that the stakeholders receive some kind of value. Now, this value or this worth or this usefulness is what we understand to be value when applied in a context for a stakeholder. And then the context is simply the circumstances that are influenced by or help us to be able to understand a change. Now, if we have to initiate, remember the change I spoke about, projects to address the fact that our customers will begin, our market and our customers are beginning to shift or tilt towards the product of a competitor. That's a very good example of a context. That is the situation. That's the circumstances that necessitated the project in this case to be able to define or design a new product for a changing market, right? So the context helps us to be able to, the context influences the change, is influenced by the change and help us to be able to understand the change. And we see in this chart that the change, need, solution, value, stakeholders, and context are inextricably linked together. Needs bring about changes, changes bring about in the cause of a change, we try to analyze and implement solution. These solutions bring about would affect stakeholders. Needs will come from stakeholders. Solutions validated against stakeholders. Value should be stakeholders will let us know what gives them value. The solutions should be able to provide value. And then again, the context is very important for understanding and applying all of these elements. Now, when addressing or performing a task using the technique, a business analyst should be able to consider how each core concept would affect the business analysis work. Ask questions like, what are the changes we are doing? Very important. What are the needs we are trying to satisfy? What are the solutions we are creating or changing? Who are the stakeholders involved? And what do the stakeholders consider to be of value? What are the contexts that we and the solution are in? Right now, if any of the core concepts experience a change, we might have to reevaluate the other core concepts. For instance, if the stakeholders change, then probably the needs are likely to change, resulting again in a change in the whole structure of the core concepts. Now let's look at some of the key terms that we want to familiarize ourselves with. First, it's business analysis information. As a part of their job, a business analyst would deal with a whole lot of information. It's broad and a diverse set of information. You analyze, you transform, you communicate and report this information. Now, information any kind and at any level that a business analyst uses as an input or as an output of their work is what we call business analysis information, right? So we, as a business analyst, one thing that is expected is that you would deal with a lot of information. And some of this information will include things like elicitation results. Think of them as documents. A lot of times there will be documents. A lot of times there will also be not be document, but just data enshrined in some sort of document or some form of communication medium. That will include elicitation results, requirements, design, solution, option, solution, scope, the change strategy. It is very important to expand business analysis work from, we don't just call it requirement, we call it business analysis information, because it will include both requirements, designs, and every other kind of document or information that helps us to be able to perform business analysis work. So yes, it should include all, we change it from requirements to information so that all the inputs and output of business analysis can be properly classed in business analysis information. We don't just call this requirements, but we want to use a wider coverage, which is business analysis information. And then we have design. Design is a usable representation of a solution, right? So if we have a need, the next thing we want to discuss is, okay, what is the solution that we can build that would be useful to the stakeholders? Now, design focus on how we can be able to derive value from building and implementing a solution. And then the solution can be a document, can be a prototype, can be a set of documents, right? So you want to think about it as a representation, right? An instruction on what and how to code can be presented in a flow chart, and that flow chart will help us to be able to follow to be able to follow or derive the coding logic or the logic around which the software will function, right? And that's a very good example of a design, a flow chart. The nature of the representation may be a document, right, or a set of documents, but can vary widely depending on the circumstances. You can, again, knowing what to code, you can use a flow chart to design what should be coded. You could also use process flow charts to be able to define how data should flow through the system. So it's very important that we understand design. Now, an enterprise is a system of one or more organizations and the solution they use to pursue shared or common set of goals. Now, let me state this again. An enterprise is a system of one or more organizations and the solution they use to pursue a shared or common set of goals or shared set of common goals. It's very easy to mistake an organization for an enterprise, but it's not always the case. Now, think of an enterprise as a group of organizations, right? A lot of times when you call, when we use the term at enterprise level, we're often referring to several organizations working together under a group or a conglomerate structure, but it goes beyond that. But in this case, we're not restricted by organizational boundaries, right? So these solutions are also known as organizational capabilities, and they can be processes or tools or information. And we'll find ourselves, irrespective of our organization, the organization we belong in, when we are working with this same, but when we are sharing processes, tools, or information. So these are several organizations working together. These are several organizations working together, right? And then they are united by processes, tools, information, and then we can define them to be an enterprise because they share processes, they share tools, and they share information, right? Now, for the purpose of business analysis, enterprise boundaries can be defined relative to the change. So in other words, we would not define enterprise boundaries by the going concern or the legal entity, right? So it's not ABC PLC or ABC Limited. We don't define what an enterprise is in business analysis. We don't constrain it by the boundaries of legal entity or a company or a department. No, we consider every organization or every unit that is working together, sharing processes, tools, and information, right? So the definition of an enterprise is defined by the change we are trying to implement or execute. So let's assume, remember, when we wanted to build, when Boeing was building the MCAS, right, or building the Boeing 747, 737 MAX, that was the ill-fated plane that brought down a lot of people in 2018, 2019. Now, of course, the Boeing organization is going to be one of the organizations working in the enterprise to roll this out. Their suppliers, including, I believe in their suppliers, including what we call them, the suppliers, including the engine manufacturers, which might have been Rolls-Royce or General Electric, will be part of the enterprise relating to the change. The regulators, right? So we also have the regulators, which is going to be the aviation regulation, right, would be part of the enterprise, right? Trying to roll out, ensure that and trying to ensure that the rollout of these technology is safe and ideal, as well as the IT service providers, right, that coded or prepared the MCAS. So you don't want to limit the definition of enterprise. You don't want to limit the definition of enterprise to a legal entity. Say, okay, Boeing is an enterprise, or the aviation regulation is an enterprise. When we're talking about enterprise, we're talking about all of them that are working together. We define that by the boundary of the change. An enterprise can be a number or any number of business. So Boeing and the suppliers and the IT service providers that provided the MCAS, that probably coded the MCAS, they would be all organizations, including the government and the regulation and the regulators, which are representatives of government or civil society. Now, that's the enterprise, and then we have organization. An organization is an autonomous group of people under the management of one single individual or board. Now, when we spoke, if you remember when we previously we looked at a couple of diagrams, we said this probably would be Boeing, and this will be all of their suppliers, right? Supplier one and supplier two, and this would probably be the IT service provider. And this would be the regulator. Now, each one of these have their own management, so they are all organizations in their right. So the definition of an organization is an autonomous group of people under the management of a single individual or a board that works towards a common goal and objective. So each of these boxes here will represent organizations, but how they work together, right, how they work together would represent the enterprise. So how they work together to be able to achieve the business analysis goal, right, is what will make them function in an enterprise structure. Organizations often have clearly defined boundaries and operate on a continuous basis. This is what we call the going concern concept in accounting, right? It's different from an initiative or a project team, which can be set up to achieve project objectives and be disbanded once the objectives are achieved. So the enterprise that might have been put together where a whole set of organizations and agents and individuals work together, who could be organized around the creation of the Boeing 737 and the MCAS. But the moment all of that was achieved, then likely the organizations would continue whether or not the project was completed. So when the project is completed, the project team and the initiative is disbanded, but the organizations will continue to live on, they'll continue to exist. And they will have a plan by definition which is a proposal for doing or achieving something. A lot of times, plans will describe the details around which a business analysis activity or work will be done or executed. It could be a set of events set in series or in a sequence, the dependencies, meaning which activities are related to the other activities, what must be done first, or what should be done next. According to the plan, the expected sequence, the schedule, and then a plan should also let us be clear on the results or the outcomes of the work. Plans should carry materials needed and the stakeholders involved. If you look at a plan will describe who does what should be done, the order and the sequence and the timing it should be done, the resources to be used to perform the job, the outcome or the expected results, the series of events, which are the what specific activities that will deliver the plan in series, in sequence, and how they relate to one another in terms of timing of execution. That's what a plan really is. And then we have a requirement. A requirement is very simply the usable representation of a need. Now, for a business analysis work to be initiated or to be carried out, there oftentimes will be a need that we need to understand to be a problem or a solution so that we could go about either resolving or correcting the need or correcting the problem, or maybe taking some actions to capitalize on the opportunity, right? Now, what a requirement means is that we have been able to understand, properly define, and represent the need in a way that allows us to be able to perform the business analysis work, transformational work. Requirements, a lot of times, to focus on understanding the kind of value that will be delivered if a requirement is fulfilled, right? So yes, we want to do a little bit of understanding of the need. We want to be able to describe the need. We want to be able to investigate and analyze the need. We want to be able to understand the kind of value that we'll extract from what fulfilling this need. The nature of the representation can be a document, right? Like I said, the same way I use a flow chart to describe a requirement, a design, that's the same way these things can also speak to requirements, right? If there are gaps in a process flow, we can also describe that as a requirement. If probably an org chart is not, or an organogram is not the right organogram to be able to properly implement an organization strategy, that's another thing that can be described again. That's another need that can be described in a document, right? Again, it will vary depending on the circumstances. Now, let's look at the word risk. The risk is the effect of an uncertainty on a change, a solution, or the enterprise. Now, risk are uncertainties, right? Risk are uncertainties that often will result in that would have effect on the goals and the objective of an organization, of a project, of a solution, and an enterprise. What a business analyst does is that they work with stakeholders. Usually, it's better you don't do this by yourself because there's always a tendency to have what we call the word is where you blind spots, right? So if I were an engineer, I would see engineering problems and may not see other kinds of problems. Other stakeholders like the IT consultants may see IT problems, and quality people may see quality problems, right? And that's why it's very important to collaborate with other stakeholders so that we can be able to identify risk without ignoring any other unintentionally. You don't want to inadvertently miss out certain risks that you normally would not consider because it's not a part of your domain. Important, therefore, that we collaborate with stakeholders to identify, assess. Again, understanding the risk will help you to assess and prioritize the risk, right? And then deal with this risk by coming up with ways you can be able to alter or change the probability or the impact of the risk. Generally, risk would have two aspects that can define. Some people will go three. One is the probability or the likelihood of the risk or the event happening. Secondly, will be the impact or the consequence of the risk happening. And then the third will be the ease of detecting the risk. If you want to consider the three models, we have probability, the impact, and the ease of detection, right? So we have probability or likelihood, we have impact or severity, or severity of the consequences, and then we have the ability to detect the risk when it occurs, right? So these are the three aspects these are the three things we look out for when we are trying to understand and prioritize a risk. Very important, right? Now, one of the things we want to do is to be able to mitigate the consequences or reduce the likelihood or mitigate the consequences, um, eliminate the source of the risk by just avoiding it, making sure that the thing that causes the risk is not even in the picture at all. Avoid the risk by deciding not to start or continue with an activity that leads to the risk, sharing the risk with parties or accepting or even reducing the risk to deal with an opportunity, right? So this is how we manage and how we deal with risk in business analysis. Now, one of the very important things to consider is what we call the business classification schema. The requirement classification schema, forgive me. Now, it says that there are 4 kinds of requirements that a business analyst will deal with, and to be able to do or to be able to achieve the best results, it's always better that a business analyst knows how to classify, knows how to identify what kind of requirements he's dealing with at any point in time. Well, the first will be the business requirements. And what is a business requirement? Business requirement will simply be a statement of goals and objectives and outcomes that will help us understand why a change has been initiated. Changes get initiated for a lot of reasons, to be able to improve business performance outcomes, to be able to streamline process, to be able to improve the service delivery for the customers, to be able to increase financial outcomes. So businesses do not start up projects or initiatives or change just for the purpose of doing it, right? There is a reason, a business objective, a business goal, a business outcome to be achieved, right? And then they can be high level or low level, right? These business requirements can be with respect to the whole enterprise, with respect to a particular business area, or just any specific project or initiative. And then we have stakeholder requirements. Now, if we say we want to be able to shorten the process and to be able to streamline the process, make it more efficient and save time, efforts, and energy in achieving a goal, we might be able to describe our business requirements in KPIs, or in the form of what certain kinds of objectives that the project or the product will have. But then again, we have stakeholder requirements. For us to be able to achieve these goals, the business requirements, the KPIs, these objectives, we need to be clear on stakeholder requirements. We will need to meet the needs of certain stakeholders, but the stakeholders will need to give us certain form of contribution in the form of requirement, in the form of elicitation, that will help us to be able to more easily know the problems to solve, to be able to achieve these goals. And these are stakeholder requirements, describes the needs of the stakeholders that must be met, right, to be able to achieve the business requirements. So if we say we want to streamline the process and cut and eliminate waste by 20-25%, leading to a reduction in financial resources and effort, that's fantastic. But then stakeholders would need to be able to contribute their quota, let you know areas where the waste happen, let you understand the most vulnerable areas, help you to be able to properly capture, describe, and understand the process so that we can be able to pick out non-value added activities from the total production cycle period. Now, so stakeholders often are the bridge between the business and the solution requirements. So you talk with the You talk and you interact with the stakeholders so that you can now be able to understand the solutions that will be fitting for that context. So let's look at solution requirement. A solution requirement will simply describe the capabilities and the qualities of a solution that will meet the stakeholder requirements. Now, as we interact, as we listen to the stakeholders who come upon an understanding of the kind of solutions that is needed, right? We'll be able to understand the capabilities, the functionalities, the qualities, the behavior of the solution, right? And then again, depending on how well we interact with the stakeholders, we would have what proper understanding, and we'll be able to describe the solution at the right level of detail. Again, right? You want to be able to make sure that your solutions are, properly described so that they can easily be implemented, right? Appropriate level of detail for development and implementation of the solution is very important. Solution requirement can be divided into two subcategories. We have functional requirement. Now, remember we said the solution requirement will describe both capabilities and qualities. Right, so we have capabilities, and that refers to functional requirements, and then we have qualities, and that reflects non-functional requirements. Now, let's deal with them one after the other. The two types of solution requirements. We have functional requirements, which is the capabilities, right, that a solution will have, the behavior it should represent, it should be able to carry out, and the information it should manage. The banking app is expected to be able to carry out financial transaction. Let's use a banking app, for instance. Right, should be able to carry out financial transaction in exchange, right? So enable exchange, right? Send money from one bank to another, and it should be able to hold financial information. It should be able to hold financial information. Not only that, it should also be able to secure financial information. And then one will expect that it should also be able to adapt, right? So not only hold financial information, hold current, the word is current and accurate financial information. So meaning that current and accurate financial information. So this would mean that if a transfer or changes in transactions happen, there should be a reconciliation mode. There should be account reconciliation, right? That is the functioning of a banking app. But again, there is also beyond just the capabilities, there's also non-functional requirements. Non-functional requirements do not directly relate to the functionality. This, what we describe is the functionality or the behavior of the solution, but describe the quality. When we look at the word, the quality, non-functional requirements, quality of service requirements, they rather describe conditions under which the solution will remain effective, or qualities, that's the word again, that the solution will have or must have. Very important to think about this as what? Quality of service requirements. Now, this banking app, right, should be able to perform transfer, hold financial information, and to an extent be secure, be able to reconcile these financial data. But then again, going beyond that, having a banking app that is localized to the language of the people, that's fantastic. Having one that is what? Extremely secure, like the most secure banking infrastructure, right? You also want probably something that can be scalable, scalable banking infrastructure. You also want something that is adaptable, right? You want a banking infrastructure that is customizable. Your banking app should be customizable. All of these are not really functional requirements, but they are quality of service requirements or non-functional requirements. the fact that the banking app can speak Igbo or Isoko or Ijo or Hausa is a very good example of localization, ensuring that it's one of the most secure banking infrastructure. Fantastic that it is customizable. You want to be able to customize it, change the color, change the form. These are all fantastic, but they are non-functional, and that can help you to be able to enjoy the solution, right? Qualities that will make you say, oh, I prefer this solution to that one, even though the functional requirement is a basic, but then this also helps you to be able to say, oh, this is my preferred solution. So you want to think about functional requirement as basic, as you know, you will expect that everyone that is in banking should be able to do this. It's not a source of differentiation. Everybody does this. Every banking app does this. That's functional requirements. Non-functional requirement, on the other hand, would be the things that set you out, right? The things that you can use to be able to compete as a, as a more valuable, as a more customer focused, as a more high quality, as a more recommended solution. So it's very important that we consider this, both functional and non-functional requirements, as part of solution requirement when we are trying to understand and describe the solution. It's very important we understand the base or the basis of the solution, which will be the functional requirement, and also the things that can make the solution more acceptable to the stakeholders, that improve the quality, the ease of use of the solution. And this will be our non-functional requirement. And then moving on, we have the fourth in the requirement classification scheme, which is the transition requirements. Our transition requirements, they're the capabilities that the solution must have and the conditions that the solution must meet to be able to transit effectively from the current state to the future state. Now, which are not needed once the change is complete. Now, let's look at them. There are two things in transition requirement, which is the last type of this requirement. We have number one, that they're required for transition from the current state to the future state. In fact, that is the first requirement, transition requirement. Transition requirement is required to be able to transit from the current state to the future state. And then the second thing is that the transition requirements are not required or needed after the change or the transition is complete. So when you're on an initiative, a change, a project, a couple of things that you would see as transition, in other words, they are needed now to be able to ensure that we can be able to move from the current state, which hopefully would be where we want to transit from, and then into the future state, which again, hopefully would be a better and a more improved state. However, they will not be needed when the change is complete, right? We'll consider them to be different from other requirement types because they are of a temporary nature. They're needed now, but they won't be needed forever. Transition requirements will address things like, let's think about transition requirements, training needs, data conversion needs. For instance, want to be able to convert data from one form to another, data conversion, business continuity. Sometimes the use of consulting, right? Certain kind of project activities, right? Would be basically transition requirements. Once you're done with them, then those activities are disbanded. They're not continuously done because we've been able to achieve the goals of the organization. We've been able to achieve the future state. We've been able to achieve the objective of the change. And then we have stakeholders. The stakeholder is an individual or a group that interacts with the solution, or the BA will interact with directly or indirectly. The most popular definition of a stakeholder is that the stakeholder is someone that is involved in the change, that influences the change, that affects the change, or can be affected by the change. It considers him or herself to be affected by the change. Another way we look at stakeholders are the people, individuals and groups that are involved in the change, interested in a change, involved in a change, or let's use the word impacted. So impacted, involved, or interested. Other definitions may say that stakeholders can affect a change, can be affected by a change, or considers themselves affected by the change. Right. Bottom line is the stakeholders will be interacted with by the business analyst. Some of them will be direct, right? Some of them will interact with the business analyst or with the solution or the process or the change indirectly. Whatever be the case, you want to be able to identify as much stakeholders as possible and try to understand their interests and the levels of their involvement, or how the project will affect or impact them, right? The Bubble Guide does not mandate that these roles be filled for any initiative, but you want to know your stakeholders, because a lot of times they are source of requirements. For you to be able to understand needs or requirements, you need stakeholders. For you to be able to gain clear picture of the context using assumptions, you need stakeholders. For you again to be able to understand the context, right? E.g., and the constraints upon the project and its environment, again, you need stakeholders. So stakeholders provide valuable information and help. And also, if not properly managed, stakeholders can be obstacles and resist an initiative or a change. It is very important, right? And then again, we have different classes of stakeholders. We have the business analyst, we have the customer, so we have the domain subject matter expert. The customer a lot of time is going to be a user, or would pay for the solution, be a major stakeholder in the use of the payment possibly of a solution, right, or a business analysis work, or a domain subject matter expert that is, that uses the domain, that is going to be probably a fundamental user of the solution. The solution is going to affect his domain. Look at, for instance, we want to build a software for taxes, or collecting accounting information. Then the accountants in the department are going to be the domain that will be affected by the rollout of that solution. We have end users that would interact with the solution to achieve a goal or objective. We have implementation subject experts that would serve the purpose of implementing the solution. We have operational support. The goal of the operational support will be to be able to ensure that when the solution is rolled out, the solution can be properly deployed to satisfy the customers, the end users, and if there are challenges or issues in its deployment and its continued use, these people can be able to help us identify and resolve these problems. We have also the project manager that will manage resources, that will be able to marshal resources to deliver the solution, to be able to implement the change. Right now, it's important that the project manager is equipped with resources and he can be able to ensure that we achieve the goals of the project, of the business analysis work, right? Irrespective of, with eyes on the constraints of scope, time, cost, and any other constraint imposed by the environment. We also have the regulator. The regulators a lot of times are sources of government agency generated mandates, right? So regulators would provide rules and regulations, boundaries and constraints, mandates around which the solution should be created or should be operated. As a sponsor, more often than not a representative of the business, that what gives both enables the project to the business analysis work to have sufficient resources, funding, and of course, political support. He's there to be able to ensure that the goals of the organization is served by the solution that is implemented. We, of course, have the supplier. Supplier would provide resources, right? Will be coordinated in the business analysis work by virtue of the resources that they would provide to provide input, the necessary inputs to be able to enable the implementation of the change. And of course, we have the tester that would validate and confirm that the solution or elements of the solution are of the right quality and fulfill expectation. And then again, we have requirements and designs. We have defined requirements and designs in earlier slides, but let's look at how they work together. Right now, a couple of things will be expected to do in business analysis will be to elicit, analyze, validate, and manage requirements. And these are some of the very key activities of business analysts. We've spoken about eliciting, which is to draw out this information from stakeholders who will analyze, which is to look, break them down, and consider them in depth with the goal of what proper understanding, so that we know what to do with this requirement, validating, ensuring that what the stakeholders acknowledge that these really that the requirements that have been identified and that have been communicated truly are the right requirement and the solutions will fulfill their need. That's some sort of validation. And then managing requirements, right? Now, these are the key activities of a BA. It's very important to recognize that the business analysts are responsible for the definition of design at some level. Maybe not the deep technical level, but they should also be able to understand the kind of what solutions and be able to describe it or define it to the implementation and the technical team in a way that they can implement or use that to perform the work. Right? The level of responsibility for design will vary depending on the perspective where the business analyst is working. Requirements, again, are focused on the need. Remember, usable representation of the need. Designs are focused on the solution. Sometimes it's not a very easy thing to identify the the distinction or the difference between requirements and design, because we use the same techniques, e.g., brainstorming, mind mapping, prioritization. We use the same techniques to elicit, model, and analyze both requirements and design. A lot of times you might not even know when you shifted from using a particular description as a requirement and you're now using it as a design. A requirement a lot of time will lead to a design, which may drive the discovery or analysis of more requirements. So the shift is so often subtle. Right now, let's look at how that can work. Now, the business requirement is going to be considering the goals of the organization. You can see that why do we want it as a business? And as we're attempting to understand this, then we are coming up with maybe surveys and questionnaires that are some form of designs to understand business requirements, right? Now, to be able to apply and understand stakeholder requirements. Now, when we implement stakeholder requirements, we're asking what are the stakeholder needs, right? We're capturing it using these initial designs. And then when we've been able to capture them, then they become requirements. And then we begin to analyze the stakeholder requirement and try to create a design to be able to describe the right kind of solution that would fulfill stakeholder requirements. Now, when we have clarity on the solution requirements, right, we've been able to properly describe the solution requirements, dealing with what do we want, then we now want to now come up with what an understanding of the conditions, the transitional requirements that will help us to be able to finally implement this solution and move from the current state to the future state. And that will help us what uncover transition requirements. And then when we understand these transition requirements and we implement them, then we'll be able to assess our outcomes. Do they fulfill the business goals and the business objectives, or do we repeat this cycle again? So the cycle will continue until all the requirements, the business requirements, majorly are met, because the business requirements are the ultimate. The stakeholder requirements, solution and transition requirements are derived from what the goals and the survival needs of the business. And that brings us to the end of this section. When we come back, we're going to begin with the first area, the first knowledge area, the first main domain of business analysis, which is the business analysis, planning, and monitoring. And then I'll see you there. Thank you for being here with us. See you in the next video. Bye for now.